Hello, everyone. A warm welcome back to our dedicated subscribers, and a special greeting to those joining us for the first time. You've just stepped into the perfect place for stories that will haunt your thoughts and leave you staring into the darkness, wide awake. Before we unravel today's eerie tale, share with us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Our community is growing rapidly, and it's thrilling to see just how far our reach extends. And remember, if you want to be among the first to experience our latest spine-chilling uploads, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Without it, you might miss out on the very stories that will keep you up at night. All right, let's dive into today's unsettling adventure. Unseen Shadows: The Escape to Fontana Lake. Hello, everyone. Today I want to share a story about Matt, a man haunted by loss who found himself pulled into an even deeper darkness one fateful weekend in the wilderness. Grab a seat, get comfortable, and make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you enjoy this kind of storytelling. The familiar chaos of the construction site faded as Matt Jenkins maneuvered his rusty old RV, Harriet, out of the parking lot and onto the highway. Matt, 54, with a lifetime of hard, honest work etched into his calloused hands and the lines on his face, looked forward to this weekend retreat more than he cared to admit. The city was suffocating, filled with reminders of Karen, his late wife. Losing her to a sudden illness 2 years ago had stripped away pieces of him that he hadn't realized were breakable. The thought of an escape into the mountains felt like the only balm for his grief. The idea for the trip came from Jake, a longtime friend and foreman at the job site. "You need fresh air," Jake had said, patting his shoulder after a rough day. "Try Fontana Lake. A quiet place to think miles of woods and water. No one's around, and it's so quiet you'll be able to hear yourself think. Just what you need." Matt had dismissed the suggestion at first. The outdoors had always been Karen's love, not his. She'd convinced him to go hiking, fishing, or camping every now and then, but the idea of doing it alone only made the memories more painful. Yet the thought gnawed at him, growing until he found himself loading up Harriet, grabbing a fishing rod, a cooler, and a week's worth of supplies. Soon he was steering his old RV toward the Appalachians, feeling the grip of his memories in the city loosen, if only slightly. The sun dipped lower as he wound through the foothills of North Carolina, the narrow roads lined with towering trees. Even the GPS had stopped working hours ago, leaving him to rely on the hand-drawn map Jake had given him. A faint shimmer finally appeared through the trees. Fontana Lake, a vast stretch of water reflecting the vibrant sunset. It was silent, no hum of traffic, no city sirens, only the soft rustle of the forest around him. Matt pulled into a small clearing by the water, and the quiet was so deep it pressed against his ears. Setting up camp became a calming routine, a break from the swirling memories that lurked in every quiet moment. He set up a small fire, cracked open a beer, and let the warmth of the flames soothe him as night fell. By the time stars glimmered in the sky, he found himself talking to Karen, as if she were sitting beside him, her laughter ringing in his ears. "You'd love it here, Karen," he murmured, voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "The stars are clear out here. Maybe you're watching them too." But as the fire died down to embers, and the last beer settled warm in his belly, a sudden pang of sadness washed over him. Exhausted, he climbed into Harriet and fell into a dreamless, heavy sleep, deeper than any he'd had in months. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the RV's windows, and for a moment, Matt felt disoriented, the ache of loss numbed but not forgotten. Stepping outside, he filled his lungs with crisp morning air, determined to shake off the memories that clung to him. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, he set out on the lake with his fishing rod, enjoying the tranquility that seemed to wrap around him like a warm blanket. The day drifted by, and he caught enough smallmouth bass to fill his cooler, their scales glistening in the sunlight. After lunch, he took a hike through the forest, the trees dense and old, their branches forming a canopy that filtered sunlight into scattered beams. He marked his path with small pieces of bright orange tape, a habit from his construction days, ensuring he wouldn't lose his way. But as afternoon turned to evening, an inexplicable feeling of unease crept up his spine. The bird calls that had been constant earlier in the day seemed to fade, leaving only a hushed silence that made the forest feel wrong. It was subtle, but Matt couldn't shake the feeling that the underbrush and tangled vines were pressing in on him, resisting his steps. With a frown, he turned back toward camp, telling himself he was being paranoid. "You're just jumpy. Too many nights alone," that's all he muttered, trying to laugh it off. That night, the silence became oppressive. The forest, once alive with whispers of wind and wildlife, seemed to hold its breath. Shadows danced beyond the firelight, stretching and twisting with the flickering flames. Matt found himself clutching his shotgun, his eyes darting between the trees. He was used to the idea of wild animals lurking around, but the sense of being watched felt different. It was something deeper, something unsettling. Sleep didn't come easily. He dozed fitfully, waking every hour, certain he'd heard branches snapping or leaves crunching outside. But each time, when he peered out of Harriet's small window, he saw nothing but the stillness of the forest. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with mist. The uneasy feeling from the night before lingered, but Matt brushed it off, determined to enjoy his time away. As he walked down to the water's edge, however, he froze. Tracks dotted the muddy shore large, irregular footprints that looked almost like a bear's, but not quite. They were spaced oddly, as if whatever had made them wasn't walking in a way that any bear should. A shiver ran down his spine. Every rational part of him wanted to turn back, pack up and leave, but he shook his head. Just an animal, he told himself. Probably more scared of me than I am of it. Still, the calm that he'd been hoping to find was gone. Throughout the day, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. He returned to camp in the late afternoon, his nerves frayed, the stillness of the forest closing in around him like a cage. That night, the sense of unease grew unbearable. Shadows flickered at the edge of the fire's glow, shifting and moving in ways that set his teeth on edge. Twice, he thought he saw movement, only for it to vanish when he turned to look. The air was thick, suffused with a scent he couldn't place something musky and damp, like old earth and rotting leaves. Then, just after midnight, he heard it. A low rumbling that seemed to echo from all directions, vibrating in his chest. He sat bolt upright, shotgun in hand, his heart pounding. The sound wasn't like any animal he'd ever heard. It was deeper, more resonant, as if it were coming from the earth itself. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of something massive moving through the underbrush. Every instinct screamed at him to hide, but a deeper, more primal urge kept him rooted to the spot. He had to see what was out there. Taking a deep breath, Matt slowly opened Harriet's door, stepping into the clearing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering light that barely pushed back the surrounding darkness. He swept his flashlight beam across the trees, his grip on the shotgun tight, and then he saw it. At first, it was only a shadow, a darker patch against the night. But as it emerged from the trees, his breath caught in his throat. The creature was enormous, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and a gait that seemed almost unnatural. Thick, Matted fur clung to its body, and its eyes glowed with an amber light that held an intelligence far beyond any animal. For a moment, they stared at each other across the clearing, the creature's chest rising and falling in deep, powerful breaths. Its wide, lipless mouth curled back to reveal jagged teeth, sharp and lethal. Matt's hand tightened around the shotgun, but his mind was numb, frozen with a fear that clawed at his reason. Then, with a deep, guttural growl, the creature charged. Matt dove to the side, the beast barreling past him, its massive body crashing into the earth with a force that shook the ground. Scrambling to his feet, he ran toward the RV, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the creature's footsteps behind him. He barely made it to the door, yanking it open and throwing himself inside just as the creature's massive claws scraped against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the side of Harriet. The RV shook with each impact, and for a terrifying moment, he thought it might be strong enough to tear through the walls. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. He could hear the creature's heavy breathing, close but not moving, as if it were waiting, testing him. Matt sat in silence, clutching the shotgun, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, until finally the creature's footsteps faded into the woods. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every rustle, every creak of the RV made him jump, certain that it had returned. When dawn finally broke, he was still sitting in the driver's seat, his eyes bloodshot, his hands white-knuckled around the shotgun. As soon as the sun was fully up, he packed his things, throwing supplies into the RV with frantic urgency. He didn't look back at the clearing, didn't dare glance at the marks the creature had left on Harriet's side. All that mattered was getting out, putting as much distance as he could between himself and whatever horrors lurked in those woods. But as he pulled onto the winding mountain road, a figure caught his eye in the rearview mirror. A man, standing at the edge of the forest, watching him with an intensity that made Matt's skin crawl. He was tall, his clothes tattered, his face pale and expressionless, but his eyes were wide, almost feverish, filled with a look that could only be described as knowing. For a moment, Matt considered stopping, asking the man what he knew, if he had seen the creature too. But a deeper instinct told him to keep going, to get as far away as possible. And so with a shudder, he pressed down on the accelerator, leaving the man and whatever dark secrets he held behind. The drive back to civilization passed in a blur. He could still feel the weight of the creature's gaze, its growl echoing in his mind. By the time he pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of a small town, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his coffee. When the young cashier asked if he was all right, he could only nod, swallowing back the terror that still lingered in his throat. He returned to his life, but things were different. Shadows seemed deeper, the silence of the night heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something from those woods had followed him back, lurking just out of sight. And in the quiet moments, when he found himself alone with his thoughts, he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he hadn't left, if he had stayed to uncover the secrets of Fontana Lake and the creature that roamed its shadows. Whatever the answer, Matt knew one thing: he would never go back. If you enjoyed this retelling, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who loves a chilling story. Thanks for joining me, and as always, be careful out there because you never know what's lurking just beyond the light. Into the unknown, the dark secrets of Tillamook Forest. The fluorescent lights in the office flickered overhead as Daniel Hayes finished the last page of his project report. He stared at the monitor, his eyes glazed from hours of staring at tiny spreadsheets. Daniel, 34, was a mechanical engineer who spent his days buried in data and numbers. Each week seemed a blur into the next, with little to break the monotony of deadlines, coffee breaks, and the endless hum of the office air conditioning. But as his gaze drifted to the circled dates on his calendar, a small smile crossed his face. His long-anticipated camping trip was only days away. He'd been planning this escape for months, a solo adventure to Tillamook State Forest. It was supposed to be a way to recharge, to remind himself there was a world outside of data and deadlines. That Friday, he hit the road, his trusty RV packed with everything he thought he'd need for a few days of peace. Tillamook State Forest was vast and remote, a thick tapestry of Douglas firs and western hemlocks stretching endlessly into the sky. It felt like an escape from civilization, a place untouched by the chaos of city life. The forest greeted him with a warm green silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Daniel maneuvered his RV through the winding, narrow roads until he found the perfect spot, a small, secluded clearing off a forgotten logging trail. The isolation was complete. There was no sign of other campers or hikers nearby. He parked the RV, set up camp, and took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to melt away. By the time evening fell, Daniel was fully immersed in his new surroundings. He'd spent the day exploring trails, photographing wildflowers, and admiring the towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly above. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a strange mix of awe and humility. The forest had been here long before him and would remain long after he was gone. He felt small, insignificant, but oddly at peace. The first night he started a small fire and cooked a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the forest as they grew louder with the darkness. Crickets chirped in a constant rhythm, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke through the stillness. It was the kind of quiet that ached in your ears, the kind that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. As the fire burned low, Daniel leaned back in his camp chair, gazing up at the stars. Without the city lights, they were brilliant, scattered across the sky like 1,000 tiny beacons. He found himself tracing constellations he hadn't thought about since childhood: Orion, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. This was exactly what he'd needed: a break from the noise, from the constant pressure of deadlines and meetings. But just as he felt himself sinking into that calm, something strange began to happen. The sounds of the forest, the crickets, the breeze rustling through the trees, the distant hoots of owls began to fade. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but within minutes, the entire forest had fallen silent. Daniel sat up, his heart beating a little faster. He'd read that animals sometimes went silent when a predator was nearby, but the silence here felt deeper, more absolute. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then he heard a low rumble, so faint it was almost imperceptible. At first he dismissed it as the wind or distant thunder, but it grew louder, deeper, resonating through the ground. It sounded almost alive. Daniel's gaze swept the edge of the clearing, his flashlight in hand. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak shadows that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. He strained his eyes, peering into the dense wall of trees. But there was nothing to see, only shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. Shaking off the chill creeping up his spine, Daniel told himself he was being paranoid. "It's just the forest settling," he muttered, though his voice sounded weak in the stillness. He retreated into his RV, double-checking that the doors were locked and the windows secure. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence pressed down on him, making every creak and groan of the RV sound like footsteps just outside. The next morning, he awoke to weak sunlight streaming through the window, the unsettling memories of the night before lingering at the edge of his mind. Shaking it off, he made a quick breakfast, determined not to let a little nighttime anxiety ruin his trip. He packed a small bag and set out on a longer hike, following a faint trail that wound through the trees. As he walked, the uneasy feeling from the night before began to return. The air felt thick, heavy, and every step seemed to echo louder than it should have. After about an hour, he stumbled upon a small clearing, perfectly circular and devoid of any underbrush. In the center stood an old stone structure, low to the ground and covered in moss. It looked ancient, almost like a shrine or altar, with strange symbols etched into the stone symbols that didn't resemble any language he'd ever seen. Curiosity overpowered his sense of caution, and he stepped closer, running his fingers over the rough stone. The symbols were deep, worn smooth by time, but still distinctly visible. Just as he was about to take a picture, a rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing. He whipped around, expecting to see a deer or a squirrel, but there was nothing. The rustling grew louder, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. Panic tightened in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, reminding himself that he was alone out here, that it was probably just the wind or a small animal. He took a step back, and the rumbling grew louder, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something massive was moving through the forest. Heart pounding, Daniel backed away from the stone structure, his eyes fixed on the dense tree line. But as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest was silent again, but this time the silence felt charged, almost electric, as if the air itself was waiting. He didn't hesitate any longer. Turning on his heel, he hurried back toward camp, his footsteps quick and sure, driven by an instinctive need to get as far away from that stone structure as possible. By the time he returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. That night, the sense of unease grew unbearable. He barely slept, jumping at every sound, every shift of shadow outside the RV. Around midnight, a loud thump jolted him awake. His heart raced as he grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior of the RV. The noise had come from outside, a heavy, deliberate impact against the metal side of the vehicle. Holding his breath, he crept to the window, peering into the darkness. For a moment he saw nothing, but then, at the very edge of the clearing, something moved, a hulking figure, half hidden in shadow. It was too dark to make out any details, but he could see its outline, massive and wrong, like something that didn't belong in this world. The figure stepped closer, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It stood on two legs, but its proportions were distorted, stretched, as if someone had taken a wolf and twisted it into a grotesque imitation of a human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce straight through him. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Without thinking, Daniel lunged for the RV door, locking it with trembling hands. He backed away, heart pounding, as the creature's heavy footsteps approached. It circled the RV, its claws scraping against the metal, leaving deep gouges in its wake. Daniel crouched in the darkness, barely daring to breathe as he clutched a hunting knife he'd bought as an afterthought. The scraping stopped, and the silence returned, thick and oppressive. Minutes stretched into hours, and he stayed there, crouched and tense, listening for any sign that the creature was still there. When dawn finally broke, he emerged from the RV, his body aching and his mind reeling. The side of the RV was scored with deep scratches, confirming that last night's nightmare had been all too real. Determined to leave, he quickly packed up his belongings, his hands shaking as he threw his things into the RV. But as he started the engine, he noticed something at the edge of the clearing, a figure watching him from the shadows. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his clothes tattered and dirty, his face pale and expressionless. But his eyes were filled with a wildness that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The man raised a hand almost in greeting, his lips stretching into a strange, knowing smile. Without a second thought, Daniel put his foot on the gas, leaving the man and whatever dark secrets he held behind. As he sped down the narrow forest road, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the creature or the strange man to appear behind him. But there was nothing, only mile after mile of winding road and dense trees. When he finally reached the nearest town, he pulled into a gas station, hands still trembling as he clutched the steering wheel. The bright lights of the station felt jarring after the darkness of the forest, and as he stumbled inside to get a coffee, the cashier gave him a concerned look. "You all right, man?" she asked, eyeing him warily. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what he'd seen, what he'd experienced in those woods? After a moment, he managed a shaky nod, mumbling something about a rough night camping before retreating to his RV. He drove home in a daze, unable to shake the memory of the creature or the man's haunting gaze. The scratches on the RV were the only evidence of what had happened, and even they seemed unreal in the harsh light of day. He tried to convince himself it had all been a hallucination, the product of too much stress and too little sleep, but deep down he knew better. The forest had shown him a glimpse of something ancient, something dark and hidden. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd brought a piece of that darkness back with him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for the moment to strike. If you enjoyed this eerie tale, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. And remember, the next time you find yourself alone in the woods, listen closely, because sometimes the forest has secrets it doesn't want you to leave behind. Thanks for joining me for another story. Stay tuned for more. The clamor of the construction site was finally behind me as I hit the open road, my old Winnebago groaning under the weight of a week's worth of supplies. It was dusk, and the city lights of Charlotte faded in my rearview mirror, leaving nothing but the promise of forested solitude stretching out in front of me. I hadn't taken a real vacation in over 10 years. My job as a construction supervisor had me out on rough terrain and unforgiving work sites for decades, leaving me with calloused hands, a squint that came from too many sunlit hours on the job, and a spine that seemed to creak more with every passing season. But now at 53, I was finally taking time off, and maybe even beginning to understand why. Clara, my wife of nearly 30 years, had been gone for 2 now, and my house, once filled with her laugh, her little projects, and endless little joys, was an empty shell that echoed with memories. I still woke some mornings expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen, but the silence was always there to remind me of the truth. So I found myself on this makeshift retreat, seeking solace in Fontana Lake, nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness. It was my foreman, Leo, who'd suggested it. After watching me slog through months of back-to-back projects, he'd clapped me on the shoulder one day and said, "Ben, you've got to take some time for yourself. There's this spot out in the Appalachians, Fontana Lake. It's so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat." Clara had loved the outdoors, hiking, fishing, camping. I could almost see her, squinting up into the trees or standing by the water with her rod in hand, that slight smile of hers glinting in the sunlight. She talked about camping in the Appalachians, but somehow we'd never made it. Now here I was, carrying the ghost of her memory with me into the deep woods. As I wound through the narrow roads of western North Carolina, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the dense, towering trees. After the final paved stretch, I maneuvered the Winnebago onto a dirt road that seemed more like an afterthought. The GPS had long since quit, leaving me to trust in Leo's hand-drawn map and my fading sense of direction. At last I reached the lake just as twilight was settling over the water, the surface of the lake catching the last flickers of light. It was serene, a perfect mirror reflecting the fiery sky, framed by the dense, shadowed woods that seemed to watch me from all sides. I parked the RV in a clearing not far from the shore, crunching over a bed of fallen leaves and twigs. Stepping outside, I filled my lungs with crisp, pine-scented air. The solitude felt strange after months of city sounds, but it was a good kind of strange, like waking up after a deep sleep. For the first time in years, I felt a hint of the calm I'd been seeking. Setting up camp was an easy, grounding distraction. I arranged my fishing gear, leveled the RV, and started a small fire by the lakeside. As night fell, stars appeared, one by one, until the sky was awash with constellations I hadn't seen in years. Sitting by the fire, a cool breeze at my back, I found myself talking to Clara, as if she were right there beside me. "You'd love this place," I murmured. It felt right, comforting even, but the quiet ache of her absence was still there. Eventually, exhaustion set in. I doused the fire, double-checked the RV's locks, and crawled into bed, the soft lull of crickets and the gentle lap of water against the shore easing me into sleep. That night, I dreamed of Clara, her laughter echoing through the forest as she beckoned me into the trees. Morning arrived with beams of sunlight streaming through the RV windows, warm and inviting. I shook off the cobwebs of sleep, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and planned out my day. The still waters of the lake beckoned, so I decided to spend the morning fishing. It was something Clara had taught me years ago, and the ritual felt like a way to keep her close. I rowed out in a small rented boat, drifting lazily on the lake, the line occasionally twitching with a fish's bite. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, and I felt myself sinking into a peaceful rhythm. But around noon, an eerie silence settled over the lake. The bird calls, which had been a constant backdrop, faded away. Even the gentle hum of insects ceased, leaving an uncomfortable stillness. At first, I shrugged it off as nothing more than my city nerves adjusting to the quiet, but the feeling of being watched began to nag at me. It was subtle, an inexplicable tingling at the back of my neck, like eyes following my every move. I glanced around, searching the dense tree line that hugged the lake, but there was nothing, only the impenetrable dark of the forest, thick and unmoving. Returning to shore, I found myself hurrying, eager to put distance between myself and whatever it was I'd sensed in the trees. I shook it off and busied myself with cooking the fish I'd caught over the fire. But the peaceful solitude that had embraced me the night before now felt more like isolation, something foreign and unsettling. As dusk crept in, I decided to take a walk through the woods near the lake, if only to shake off the unease. I marked my path with bright orange surveyor's tape, an old habit from years of working on job sites. The forest was thick, towering trees blocking most of the sky. The air grew cooler as I ventured deeper, the shadows stretching and shifting in the fading light. But after a short while, I noticed something odd, the usual sounds of the forest birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl were gone. In their place was an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Even the faint crunch of leaves underfoot felt loud, echoing in the emptiness. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, more pronounced. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn back, so I did. My footsteps quickened as I retraced my path, not daring to look over my shoulder. Back at the camp, I stoked the fire to a full blaze, the flames licking the cool night air. The RV door felt like a secure barrier, and the fire a safe perimeter. But as the night wore on, the sense of wrongness only intensified. Shadows seemed to dance just outside the fire's reach, flickering with an almost predatory grace. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the flickering firelight. But my nerves were raw, every crackle of burning wood making me jump. The night stretched on, and sleep came reluctantly, fitful and shallow, broken by strange dreams. In them, Clara's face flickered in the darkness, her voice lost to some unseen force. Morning came thick and misty, a light fog hanging over the lake. I stepped outside, stretching the tension from my muscles, and froze. Deep, heavy tracks encircled the RV, leading in and out of the surrounding trees. They were massive, with a gait that seemed all wrong, spaced too far apart for a bear or any animal I could think of. The prints led directly to the water's edge and then vanished. The chill ran down my spine. It could have been a bear, I told myself, though the explanation didn't sit well. I tried to go about my day, but the feeling of being watched followed me, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I spent the day close to the RV, sticking to the clearing, but my mind kept returning to the tracks, the unnatural silence, and that feeling of something lurking just beyond my sight. Night fell too quickly, and as darkness swallowed the clearing, my unease grew. The fire's light seemed weaker, barely holding the shadows at bay. Just after midnight, a sound broke the silence, a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The growl grew louder. The man by the lake. The fire crackled as the woods around me fell silent, the dense Appalachian forest casting shadows across Fontana Lake. This was my third night camping here, and the solitude was starting to weigh on me. It had felt liberating the first 2 nights, the quiet contrasting so starkly with the constant noise and deadlines of my life back in Charlotte. But tonight the silence felt different, heavy, almost oppressive. A chill had settled over the lake, the kind that sank into your bones. Wrapping my jacket tighter around myself, I glanced up. The stars were veiled by thick clouds, leaving only the fire's glow to illuminate my camp. The lake itself was unnervingly still, its dark water reflecting nothing but a void that seemed to stretch out forever. That's when I noticed the smell of musty, almost rotting scent hanging in the air. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it's just the damp woods, I muttered, trying to shake the feeling of unease growing in my chest. The twig snapped. My head jerked toward the sound, scanning the tree line. Nothing but shadow. I shifted in my camp chair, my senses on edge, and tossed another log onto the fire. The flames danced higher, casting long shadows that stretched out toward the water. Then I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the lake, barely visible in the dim light. Tall and thin, his form was hunched, his shoulders slouched, as if carrying a burden I couldn't see. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart beating loudly in my ears. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey there, you okay?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. He just stood there, unmoving, a dark silhouette against the lake. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, a primal instinct telling me something was off. But I pushed it down. Maybe he was lost or hurt. Maybe he was just some other camper looking for a place to stay the night. With a forced smile, I stood up and took a tentative step forward, my boots crunching against the cold earth. "Do you need any help?" "It's dark out here," I said, keeping my tone light. My words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered, almost swallowed by the silence that had once felt so calming. As I moved closer, the figure began to come into focus, and my stomach tightened. His skin was pale, almost sickly gray, stark against the black lake. His clothes were worn, tattered as if they'd been dragged through brambles and mud. His face, gaunt and hollow, stared out from the shadows, his eyes fixed on me with a vacant, penetrating gaze. I forced a smile, taking another slow step forward, still clinging to the hope that he was just another camper, someone stranded in the woods. But the closer I got, the less I believed it. His eyes they didn't blink, didn't shift, just bored into me, unseen yet oddly aware. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice faltering. The words echoed, brittle and fragile against the dense silence. But again, he gave no answer, his gaze unwavering, his face as expressionless as a mask. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to turn and leave, to put as much distance as I could between myself and the strange figure. But I hesitated. Despite every rational thought telling me to go, I found myself rooted in place, staring back at him, as if trapped in some silent standoff. Finally, he moved just a small tilt of his head, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. His eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto mine, filled with something unreadable, something wild and dangerous. The message was clearly. That single movement broke the trance. I turned quickly, nearly stumbling as I made my way back to the fire. I kept my back to him, my steps hurried, my breaths shallow. I didn't dare look over my shoulder until I reached the warmth of the fire, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned back toward the lake, but he was gone. I tried to shake off the encounter, to convince myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. Maybe he was just another camper, someone as unsettled by the silence as I was. But something about him lingered in my mind, a cold weight pressing down on my thoughts. I stoked the fire, watching the flames dance higher, trying to use its warmth to fend off the unease creeping into my bones. As the night wore on, the forest around me remained disturbingly quiet, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just the crackling fire and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, the RV door locked, my ears straining for any sound outside. Every creak, every sigh of the wind against the trees felt magnified, each one pulling me back from the edge of sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of that man by the lake, his hollow gaze, the strange, empty look in his eyes. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were haunted. I was back by the lake, but this time I wasn't alone. I could see him standing there, his face blank and expressionless, his eyes wide and empty. He was closer now, almost near the fire, just watching, his stare as cold and lifeless as the water behind him. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, trapped in some invisible cage. I woke with a start, my skin clammy, the cold sweat drenching my clothes. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, weak glow across the campsite. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was just a dream. But a part of me knew better. The next morning, I stepped outside the RV, breathing in the crisp air and trying to shake off the lingering dread from the night before. The daylight felt like a reprieve, the sun cutting through the fog and casting a warm glow over the lake. I tried to convince myself that whatever I'd seen, whatever I'd felt, was nothing more than a trick of the night. I decided to walk down to the shore, hoping the fresh air and the gentle lapping of the lake would clear my mind. But as I approached the spot where I'd seen the man, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the mud along the shore, were footprints. Large, deep impressions in the wet earth, leading from the edge of the lake into the trees. They weren't mine. I hadn't been down this far before. They were fresh, too fresh, as if someone had been standing there just moments before I arrived. A shiver ran down my spine, and I found myself instinctively scanning the tree line. But there was nothing, only the quiet murmur of the forest. I stood there for a moment, caught between fear and curiosity, my eyes fixed on the tracks. Part of me wanted to follow them, to see where they led, to understand who or what had been standing there last night. But common sense won out. I turned back, my heart pounding, and hurried back to camp, leaving the eerie footprints behind. The day passed uneventfully, though the image of those footprints lingered at the back of my mind. I kept to the campsite, staying within the fire's reach, by every sense on edge. The day passed in a slow crawl, and when evening fell, an uneasy tension settled over me once more. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As night descended, I stoked the fire, keeping it burning bright. I tried to keep myself occupied, reading, cooking, anything to distract from the nagging dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. But as the hours wore on, I found myself glancing more and more toward the lake, my eyes scanning the shore for any sign of movement. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, I saw him again. The man was back, standing in the exact same spot as the night before. His posture was unchanged, his shoulders slouched, his face barely visible in the firelight. He was watching me, that same vacant, unsettling stare fixed on my every movement. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I gripped the edge of my chair, my knuckles white. The logical part of my brain told me to ignore him, to stay by the fire, to keep myself safe. But something else, something primal, compelled me to confront him, to demand an answer to the questions haunting my thoughts. I stood slowly, my legs trembling, and took a step toward him. "Who are you?" I called, my voice tight, barely steady. "Why are you here?" Again, silence. He didn't move, didn't respond. His gaze was unblinking, fixed, as if he were studying me, waiting for something. Anger flared up, cutting through my fear. "Answer me," I shouted, my voice echoing across the lake. This time he reacted. His head tilted slightly, just as it had the night before, and his eyes seemed to focus, locking onto mine with an intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. The message was clear, sharper than words could convey. Leave. In a flash, he was gone, melting back into the shadows as if he'd never been there. My hands shook as I backed away from the shore, stumbling as I turned and nearly tripped over my own feet. I scrambled into the RV, locking the door behind me, my heart racing, a cold panic spreading through my chest. I didn't know what I'd just seen, didn't know if it was real or some figment of my imagination, but I knew one thing for certain: I had to get out of there. I packed up in a frantic rush, throwing my gear together with trembling hands, my eyes darting toward the windows, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. But the lake remained empty, the campsite silent. Finally, I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the campsite, my hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled tension. I didn't look back as I drove down the winding dirt road, the trees closing in around me, every shadow feeling like it was hiding something, watching, waiting. The narrow road twisted and turned, the trees pressing in, their branches scraping against the sides of the RV like fingers clawing at the windows. I could feel the weight of the forest bearing down on me, suffocating. as if it were alive, as if it didn't want me to leave. Just as I thought I was free, a figure appeared in the road ahead, standing motionless in the middle of the path. It was him. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt just feet away from him. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared, my hands shaking on the wheel, my breath shallow and fast. He stood there, still and silent, his face hidden in shadow, his eyes fixed on me with that same unblinking stare. For a moment, we were locked in a standoff, a silent battle of wills. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed back toward the lake, his gesture calm, deliberate, like some final, wordless command. I felt a cold terror grip me, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I yanked the wheel, guiding the RV off the narrow road and into the woods, the underbrush scraping against the sides as I tore through the trees, desperate to escape. Branches snapped and cracked, the RV lurching as I plowed forward, not caring where I went, only that I got away from him. I could feel his gaze on me, piercing, unyielding, even as the trees closed in, the forest swallowing me in its depths. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed lake, my mind racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess of terror and disbelief. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never set foot near Fontana Lake again. Some places are meant to be left alone, their secrets buried in the shadows where they belong. The cabin in the woods. I hadn't planned on staying out in the forest past nightfall. But a few wrong turns and hours of hiking later, I was hopelessly lost, with the sun quickly sinking behind the trees. The map on my phone had died along with the battery, leaving me to navigate by gut instinct and an old compass I found in the bottom of my backpack. My campsite, wherever it was, felt like a distant memory. Just as the light was slipping away completely, I saw a dark shape looming in the distance between the trees. A cabin. It looked old and weathered, standing alone in a small clearing, its roof sagging and the wood grayed from years of exposure. I knew I should probably keep walking, but the forest was quickly growing darker and colder, and the thought of spending the night out here without shelter made my stomach turn. So, taking a deep breath, I made my way to the cabin, hoping I could rest there until morning. As I approached, I noticed strange markings on the wooden walls, faint and weathered but unmistakable. Symbols I didn't recognize, carved deep into the wood as if to ward off something or someone. The windows were dark, reflecting only my own shadow as I drew closer. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent forest. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a few broken chairs and a thick layer of dust covering the floors. A faint, musty smell lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of damp wood. I shivered as I stepped inside, the sudden chill of the place wrapping around me like a blanket. I closed the door behind me, feeling a strange sense of relief and dread at once. The cabin was only a single room, with an old wood-burning stove in the corner and a small, rough-looking cot against the far wall. I set my backpack down and took a seat on the cot, grateful to finally be off my feet. But the relief didn't last long. As I sat there in the dim light, I started to notice odd things about the room. Scratches marked the floorboards near the door, thin, jagged lines crisscrossing over each other like the frantic work of an animal. The air was unnaturally cold, too, as if the warmth from the day had been sucked out entirely. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dust-covered floor, near the center of the room, I saw footprints. They were small, childlike, and led to a darkened corner of the cabin. My stomach tightened as I stared at the prints, following their path to the corner where shadows pooled thickly, obscuring whatever might be hiding there. My mind raced, rationalizing the sight. Maybe someone else had found this place before me, someone with a child thought. But even as I thought it, the logic didn't feel right. The dust was thick and undisturbed, except for those small footprints. I turned away, trying to ignore the strange unease settling over me. Pulling out my flashlight, I checked the cabin more thoroughly, sweeping the beam across the walls. But as I did, I noticed more symbols carved into the wood. They were like the ones outside, strange, intricate, and haunting. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, certainly not something left by anyone passing through. I tried not to think about it, focusing instead on my plans for the night. I figured I could block the door with one of the chairs, just in case. I pulled one of the rickety chairs over and wedged it under the door handle, feeling a small measure of security. But just as I settled back onto the cot, I heard it the faintest sound, barely audible over the silence. A whisper. I froze, my heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, but it was faint and disjointed, as if coming from far away. I couldn't make out the words, just the sound of it, curling and twisting through the cold air. My hand went to the flashlight, gripping it tightly as I scanned the cabin. But there was no one there. I was completely alone. At least I thought I was. Hours passed, each one stretching on for an eternity. The whispering had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now, pressing in from all sides. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, maybe something caught in the old chimney, but I didn't believe it. The cabin felt wrong. There was a presence here, something that watched from the shadows. Eventually, I managed to doze off, my body too exhausted to fight the pull of sleep any longer. But it wasn't restful. My dreams were dark, filled with strange shapes and shadows that crept closer, whispering my name. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, the cabin cloaked in pitch black darkness. I reached for my flashlight, turning it on and casting the beam across the room. And that's when I saw it. The chair I had placed under the door handle was moved, sitting now in the middle of the room, facing me. My blood went cold. I knew, without a doubt, that I hadn't moved it. My hands shook as I clutched the flashlight, my mind racing with explanations. Maybe it had fallen on its own, or maybe I had moved it in my sleep. But deep down I knew the truth. Someone or something had moved it while I slept. I swung the flashlight beam around the room, illuminating every dark corner, every shadowed nook, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement, just the silence, thick and unyielding. For a moment, I considered leaving, braving the dark forest rather than staying another minute in that cabin. But then I heard it again, that whisper. Louder this time, almost like a child's voice, soft and pleading. Please. The word was barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the room. The whisper had come from the dark corner, the same spot where I'd seen the footprints. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. Do you need help? Silence. But then, just when I thought the whisper had vanished, I heard it again, closer this time. Please, don't let him in. The chill crawled up my spine, my mind racing with terror. I pointed the flashlight at the corner, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But the beam revealed nothing, only empty shadows. Still, the voice had sounded so real, so close. My heart pounded as I looked back at the door. Don't let him in. Who was he? What was he? The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The hours dragged on, each one blending into the next, my nerves fraying with every passing minute. I kept the flashlight on, sweeping it across the room every few moments, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But the cabin remained still, silent, as if holding its breath. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls, I heard it. The knock on the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but there was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. My heart stopped, every muscle in my body freezing in place as I stared at the door, my mind screaming for me to move, to hide, to do something. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I backed away, my eyes glued to the door, every instinct telling me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin was too small, the only exit blocked by whatever was knocking. Is someone there? I stammered, hating how terrified I sounded. Silence. And then a voice, low and raspy, barely more than a whisper. Let me in. The words sent a wave of terror crashing over me, my stomach twisting in fear. The voice was wrong, somehow hollow and empty, as if spoken by something that didn't quite understand language, something that was trying to mimic human speech. I took another step back, shaking my head. Go away, I shouted, my voice cracking. The silence returned, stretching out for what felt like an eternity. I held my breath, praying that whoever or whatever was on the other side would leave. But then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched, paralyzed with fear. The doorknob twisted, creaking as it turned, but somehow the chair I'd wedged under the handle held, preventing it from opening fully. The rattling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, through the crack in the door, I saw a single, pale hand reaching through, fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. The skin was ashen, stretched taut over knobby joints, and the fingernails were long, jagged, like claws. It reached out, scratching at the wood, the sound piercing the quiet, filling the cabin with a grating, desperate scrape. A voice followed, raspy and strained, as if it were struggling to speak. Let me in. The hand clawed at the door, each scratch sending chills down my spine, until finally it retracted, disappearing back into the dark. The rattling stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't move for a long time. Every nerve on edge, my body locked in fear. I stayed that way until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the cracks, filling the cabin with light, banishing the shadows. When morning finally arrived, I didn't waste a single moment. I grabbed my backpack, my hands trembling as I packed my things, barely able to focus. The sunlight was a relief, but the cabin still felt wrong, the memory of that hand lingering in my mind. As I opened the door to leave, I stopped. There, on the outside of the door, were deep scratches, claw marks etched into the wood, as if something had tried to tear its way inside. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me away from the cabin, away from whatever horror had lurked there. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached the familiar trails, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that cabin, but I know one thing for sure: some places are meant to be left alone. The memory of that whisper, that desperate plea, still haunts me, the words echoing in my mind whenever I'm alone at night. please. Don't let him in.